Recording started.
Okay, so this, the first two lessons, guys, were really important lessons, the endocrine system and the nervous system. So that's why I really want to focus some time on this here. We're also going to go over some questions again. I thought that this would be good to do it in a whiteboarding session because you'll tend to remember some of these things a little better. And so some of this stuff we're going to whip over, and then some of these things we're going to kind of camp on a little bit more and delve into a little bit more. So first thing, just a reminder again, so hormones produced in one area of the body, they're chemicals, and they have an effect on other areas of the body. We're not going to really get into the, exocrine hormones and the different type of hormones other than the difference between the steroid hormones and the protein hormones. And you guys might remember that the difference between them, one of the main differences, the steroid hormones bind to a receptor that's inside the target cell, and then after that happens, you get a whole cascade of different steps happening. With the protein hormones, they bind to a receptor on the cell membrane. So that's one of the main differences. So again, you have a hormone receptor binding to a target cell, target organ, which is the cell, which is part of the organ. Okay, so we're going to talk at this point about the pituitary gland and the hypothalamus. Again, really important. You guys might remember that the pituitary gland is known as the master gland, controls all the other endocrine glands. As you can see, it's found in the brain. It's found close to the hypothalamus. And if the pituitary gland is the master gland, and the hypothalamus is kind of the master of the master gland because it controls the pituitary gland. Another important term in Bio 30 is homeostasis, and basically it means balance. It has to do with body systems maintaining balance. Sometimes body systems get thrown out of balance, so homeostasis is a way of bringing back that balance to the body. Going now to just the pituitary gland, just breaking it down a little bit. The posterior pituitary produces ADH, or vasopressin. Normally we recognize it as ADH and oxytocin. Probably ADH is a little bit more important to focus on. So the job of ADH is to maintain water levels high in the blood by limiting the amount of water lost in the urine, and it acts in the kidneys. So remember that ADH is in the kidneys, and it has to do with water levels. Okay? And again, it stands for antidiuretic hormone. So now we're just going to talk about negative feedback. You might remember that negative feedback, whenever you produce a hormone, eventually you want to shut it down, right? Because it's going to have an effect on body systems, but you don't want it to continue to be produced, or otherwise things go out of whack. So once it's produced for a while to do its job, but then you turn it off. And I've listed all the hormones produced in the anterior pituitary. Not all of them are equally important. Some of them are more important, like the growth hormone. So we're not going to go over all of them now. Growth hormone is important. Number 2, TSH is important. ACTH is important. Number 6 and 7 we're going to go into later, FSH and LH. And LH is females, ISH is males. And then human growth hormone is important as well. Number 9 is maybe not so important for this course. Okay, so I've just listed them all here, but just remember these are all produced in the anterior pituitary. Okay? All right, TSH, very important. It stands for thyroid stimulating hormone. Stimulates the thyroid to release the hormone that the thyroid normally produces. And the most important one we've looked at so far is thyroxine. ACTH, what does it do? It stimulates the adrenal glands to release the hormones that it normally produces. And the one we've looked at so far that's the most important is cortisol. So again, TSH produces thyroxine, ACTH produces cortisol. And we'll look at those in a little bit more detail later on. Okay, so the gonadotropic hormones stimulate the development of the gonads. Okay, gonads is just the word for the testes and ovaries. Of course, testes in males, ovaries in females. So the 2 gonadotropin hormones are follicle-stimulating hormone, or FSH, and luteinizing hormone, or LH. Okay, so just to look at them in a little more detail, and I want to just explain something that might help you remember the difference between them, or make a bit of a connection here. Follicle stimulating hormone. So what does it do? It stimulates the maturation of sex cells, or another name we have for that is gametes. Okay, so in a male, that's going to be sperm. It's going to be the egg or ovum in the female. And so if you want to remember, if you want to try to make a connection between FSH and maturation of the sex cells, you might remember F stands for finishing. Just kind of make a connection between F and finishing. Finishing kind of relates to maturation. Okay, so so now let's look at the other hormones. So LH is in females, and in males it's ISCH. Okay, and so what do they do? Well, in females, LH stimulates the release of the ovum about once a month, so the egg cell, in the ovaries, and also the production of one of the female hormones, which is progesterone. Okay, and then LH in the male is called, again, ISCH. It stimulates sperm production and the release of testosterone. So again, remember, two important jobs for each one of those, LH and ISCH. Each one of them has to do with the release of the, either the ovum or the sperm, okay? And then also they have to do with the production of an important hormone. So again, in females, progesterone, males, testosterone, okay? So again, just remembering the difference between FSH and LH and the jobs they do, okay? But again, those are the gonadotropic hormones. We'll go into a little bit of questions later on to kind of test your knowledge of those. Human growth hormone, or HGH, produces skeletal growth. It has to do with the growth of the bones and the muscles. Okay. Now the thyroid gland, we've already said before, it produces TSH. TSH is produced in the pituitary. It's located around your throat. All right, and sometimes if you have thyroid cancer, they might have to get some treatment around the throat area. Okay, so we know that it produces thyroxine. Here's a really important point, though, as far as thyroxine. You can see at the bottom there, thyroxine breaks down both fat and sugars, and probably we're more concerned about the breakdown of sugars. Okay, so that's the most important thing that we're looking at. And again, glucose is the main sugar that we're looking at. Okay, so on to the next page, and we'll have a few questions that will kind of test some of this stuff. So first of all, just want to have you look again at this chart here. So you can see that the hypothalamus is going to produce something. It's going to produce something called thyroid release factor, TRF, sorry. That then causes the pituitary gland to produce TSH. TSH causes the thyroid gland to produce thyroxine. When you get too much thyroxine happening, a message is sent to the hypothalamus that says, stop producing this TRF that gets the whole process going. So again, that's known as negative feedback. Again, that relates to when you have too much hormone being produced and the body says, okay, we've got to shut it down. It's also having to do with a homeostatic response, because again, it's homeostasis, sense of balance in the body, so it's bringing about that balance. Okay, so I've just kind of put together these different things. Hypothalamus produces TRF, which causes the pituitary to produce TSH, which causes the thyroid to produce thyroxine. And you can see I've kind of got them all together right here. Okay, so just a question then, guys, just to make sure we're on track. So how does thyroxine affect blood sugar? I know we've gone over this before in the assignment, just to make sure we're remembering this. So what does it do to blood sugar again? Will it increase it, decrease it? I noticed Tristan's typing there. Okay, dissolving of sugar. Yeah, I would say breaking down of sugar. Okay, it's breaking down sugar, so in other words, the sugar you would have in the blood, there's going to be less of it, right? The more thyroxine you're having, because it's going to be breaking down that glucose or blood sugar, you're going to have less blood sugar, right? Okay, so what would you say for the next question? How do the pituitary and hypothalamus interact to regulate thyroxine levels? What would you say? Again, we know that the hypothalamus is controlling the pituitary. So what is the hypothalamus producing that's going to affect the pituitary? And then what's the pituitary going to produce that's going to affect the thyroxine levels? Let's start with the hypothalamus. What does it produce, guys? Can you remember what the name of the substance is that the hypothalamus produces? You can even look above if you want. Okay, so it produces thyroid releasing factor, TRF, and then after that, what does that cause the pituitary to produce? Okay, thyroid stimulating hormone, and then after TSH causes the thyroid to produce what? Okay, good stuff. And again, we've got these three guys. We got the idea, thyroxine. Okay, so just remember the connection between all three of these, and remember where each one is produced. This is the hypothalamus, this is the pituitary gland, and this is produced by the thyroid. Okay? And again, what is negative feedback again, guys? Okay, homeostatic response. And what chemicals does it have to do with in the body? Actually, it doesn't have to do with only these types of chemicals, I should say, but what is one type of chemical we looked at that the negative feedback relates to? Hormones, that's right. So again, you can have different things in the body. You can have homeostatic response having to do with acid-base as well. You might have too much acid, you need to produce more base or something like that, or at least a buffer. Anyways, okay, we'll get on to the next question here. So the next question here is testing your knowledge of the different hormones. And so the first one is talking about STH, or human growth hormone. So I don't know if you can read the 6 choices there. I'll read them out loud just in case you can't. So we want to see which one has to do with human growth hormone. So is it number 1, release of thyroxine? Number 2, development of bones and tissues? As soon as you hear it, just write it down. Number 3, water reabsorption by kidneys. Number 4, development of follicle and sperm. Number 5, ovulation and maintenance of the corpus luteum. Okay, that's right, Mary. So human growth hormone has to do with the development of bones and muscles. Okay, how about LH? Is that number 1, release of thyroxine? Okay, we know it's not 2. Is it 3, water reabsorption by the kidneys? Is it 4? Okay, so we say, Tristan says it's 5, ovulation and maintenance of the corpus luteum. That's right. So, so again, LH has to do with producing an egg cell once a month, and we looked at that earlier. Also has to do with the maintenance of the corpus luteum. In the corpus luteum, what happens is the follicle produces the egg cell, but eventually the follicle becomes something else, which is the corpus luteum. And the corpus luteum continues to produce hormones after ovulations occurred. Produces progesterone. So, so that's what that's all about. Okay, so TSH, again, is that the release of thyroxine, number 1? Is it water reabsorption by the kidneys? Okay, so we're saying it's number 4, development of follicle and sperm. Okay, it's actually the release of thyroxine. Remember, TSH, that's the one that's produced in the pituitary, and it causes the thyroid gland then to produce thyroxine. Okay, and then so what would FSH be? I guess the ones we're left with are water reabsorption of the kidneys, by the kidneys, development, okay, let's see, development of follicle and sperm. Okay, so that one's going to be development of follicle and sperm, right? If we just remember FSH, finishing, remember finishing or maturation of the sperm and the egg. So that's why that one would be number 4. Okay. All right, so just moving along here. The thymus gland, we haven't gone into that in a lot of detail, but it releases white blood cells. And white blood cells are kind of like the body's warriors, if you want. They fight infection. The presence of a lot of white blood cells in your body says there's been a lot of infection going on. So it's both good and bad that you're seeing a lot of white blood cells in your body. It means your body's doing its job, but on the other hand, it means there's some sort of disease, right? Okay, so we looked at the adrenal gland, and we saw there was two parts to the adrenal gland, the adrenal medulla and the adrenal cortex. You may remember before we kind of looked at the different chemicals that are produced in each one, and we know that one of them produces adrenaline. And I thought this was kind of a cool picture here. I don't know how they staged this picture. I don't know if somebody purposely staged it or what, but so the reason I chose this picture is because the adrenal gland produces adrenaline, which, as you know, if someone has a lot of adrenaline, it gives them a lot of strength, it gives them the ability to run fast and that kind of stuff. It accelerates your heart rate and other kinds of body reactions during a time of crisis. And we call that the fight or flight response. Okay, so adrenaline or epinephrine is responsible for the fight or flight response. Okay, and we'll go on to the next screen. Now, so here are some of the things that happen during the fight or flight response. See, what the body does, it causes some things to be activated in the body because some things need to be done, right? Other things don't need to be done, so it kind of conserves the energy in certain areas. It dilates our pupils, opens them up really wide, right? Okay, so if we're afraid, you know, our pupils get really wide. Some other things that are activated are increased respiration rates. So in other words, we're breathing faster, right? We want to get more oxygen into our body if we're, you know, during a crisis situation. The other thing that happens is, that's right, the other thing that happens is bronchial dilation, in other words, opening up of the airways, because again, we want to get more oxygen into the lungs. We also have more of a release of glucose from, for use by the muscles from glycogen. Okay, so glycogen again is a storage substance for glucose, and so glycogen is converted into glucose because our body needs to use that energy. Okay, so those are some of the things that are activated during the fight or flight response. So what things are shut down? Well, we have less digestive activity. Our body doesn't really need to be digesting its food so much, right? So blood supply is limited to the areas that are digesting things. Another thing that happens is contraction of the bladder as well, okay? So that could, so we kind of shut down things that aren't needed as much in an emergency situation. So looking at the question here, guys, following an emergency, okay, so this is saying after an emergency happens, which response helps to bring the body back to a relaxed state? So what do you guys think, just reading those over? Which one do you think? Okay, so Mary says B, decrease of the output of adrenaline. Does that make sense as well, Tristan? You know, after an emergency situation, we don't need adrenaline, epinephrine anymore. We want to shut down that whole process, right? We want to get back to the stuff like digesting and stuff that we kind of ignored during the fight or flight response, right? Okay. I was going to get into the other, I'll just briefly get into it, and we're going to get into it later as well. The opposite of the fight or flight response is called the rest or digest response. And we'll get into that a little bit more when we get into the nervous system. Okay, so next question here, guys. In animals, a short-term response to stress may occur faster than prolonged response to stress because, so what do you think the answer would be for this? Which body system is going to have to do with a short-term response to stress? In other words, a really fast response to stress. Which body system is going to have to do with a more long-term, prolonged response? In other words, one that takes a longer period of time. What do you think? Any ideas? That's right. because the nervous stimulation is going to occur faster than hormonal stimulation, right? All right, good stuff. So we will go on to the next one. All right, so just really quickly, aldosterone accelerates salt recovery by the kidneys. Okay, again, you'll need to find ways to remember, because I know in biology there's a lot of different science terms to remember. Maybe even if you remember that it's got a L, S, and a T, like the word salt. Actually, it's got all the letters of the word salt in there. That might help you remember something about aldosterone connection with salt. Cortisol, it has to do with reducing inflammation. You know, if you've got some sort of injury in your body, that might give you some cortisol. It also increases the synthesis, in other words, the production of glucose by the liver. Okay? And you guys might remember we went through a question before that had to do with ACTH and cortisol. So if we want to produce more cortisol, we produce more ACTH. But if we want to produce less cortisol, if we want to, if we've got too much cortisol being produced already, then eventually less ACTH is going to be produced because we've got one of those negative feedback mechanisms going on. Okay? So now on to the pancreas and two important substances that it produces glucagon and insulin. Again, remember the specific area in the pancreas where insulin is produced is what's called the islets of Langerhans. So it's in the beta cells. And insulin is definitely one of the most important substances we're looking at. Of course, it's a relationship to diabetes. You guys might know this. I'm not sure if you realize this, but insulin was actually discovered by Canadians, Banting and Best. But it's kind of interesting that Banting and Best, I believe they were somewhere in Ontario, but it was actually a guy from Alberta who was the first to purify insulin. Now, his name was Alfred Kulip, but unfortunately, I'm not sure if I've got this perfectly right. It's something like he forgot to record everything down, so he wasn't given the Nobel Prize for the discovery of insulin, but Banting and Best decided that he had deserved to share in it as well. So I believe they did share part of the recognition as well with him. So yeah, just kind of a cool thing as well. So just looking at the difference between glucagon and insulin, glucagon causes glucose to be released from glycogen. So again, when we have the sugar, it's stored in the form of glycogen, but when we need it, it's taken from that glycogen and used to produce glucose. Okay, so in other words, glucagon is going to cause more glucose to be in the bloodstream. Okay? Insulin produces less glucose to be in the bloodstream. Why does it produce less in the bloodstream? Well, because what insulin does, it opens up the cells to glucose, so cells can use that glucose. You look at it as kind of like unlocking the lock. It's kind of like insulin is like the key that unlocks the cell's ability to use glucose. Okay? So when we have insulin, we're going to have less. Hey, Brendan, how's it going? Did you just get here just now? Okay, good stuff. How's things going today? Oh, is that right, eh? Late night? Oh, yeah, I kind of feel like that sometimes too, eh? So hey, Brendan, we're just going over right now two important substances produced in the pancreas, glucagon and insulin. So if you want to check out the stuff we were looking at earlier on the recording, but just kind of noticing a bit of a difference here that glucagon causes the production of glucose from glycogen. And so in other words, you're going to have higher blood sugar with glucagon, And with insulin, you're going to have lower blood sugar because we were just talking about the fact that what it does is it kind of opens up the cell. It's like the key that opens up the cell that allows glucose into the cell to be used by it. But because it's opening up the cell, this sugar is coming from the bloodstream. So insulin is going to result in lower blood sugars, whereas glucagon is resulting in higher blood sugars because it's taking glycogen, which is kind of the body's storage form of sugar, and it's using it to produce glucose. Okay, so both those important substances are produced in the pancreas. And okay, so for this question here, where it says, how does glucagon regulate blood sugar levels, what would you say? What's kind of the step, the process that's taking place here? What substances are involved when we're talking about glucagon? Okay, so glucose, and where's that glucose coming from? That's right, it's released in the pancreas. And it causes what to produce the glucose? It's breaking down what in order to produce glucose? What substance is that again? Glycogen. Okay, so we got 3 G's there, right? Glucagon causes glycogen to be broken down to produce glucose. Okay? So, just to review here then, for the next question, it's saying that there was a tumor on a gland. A tumor on a gland can increase the gland secretions. And, sorry, I'm just gonna do something on the school here. Okay, done. So if each of these hormones is being produced by some gland because of a tumor, we're needing to decide here what's going to happen to the sugar levels. Okay, so for insulin, so we're saying there's going to be more of each one of these hormones, so insulin, epinephrine, and thyroxine. So if you have more insulin, what happens to sugar levels? Do they go up or down? Okay, Mary says up. Anybody else? Down. Okay. Sugar levels are actually going to go down because remember the sugar is going into the cells, so we're going to have less in the blood. Okay? How about epinephrine? Sugar levels going to go up or down? I know we haven't really talked about this one today. Okay, sugar levels are actually going to go up the more epinephrine we have. And if you think about it, I guess we have talked about it a little bit with the flight or fight response, because epinephrine is the same thing as adrenaline, and when you have adrenaline going, you want to have the body able to, be able to deal with whatever kind of crisis situation. So we talked about earlier how you speed up breathing, you increase the lung, open up the lungs, bronchial dilation, and you also increase the amount of glucose going around, right? And how about thyroxine? If you increase thyroxine, what's going to happen to the blood sugar levels? Remember, we say that thyroxine has to do with the metabolism of sugars, and that's kind of another way of saying that it breaks down the sugars. So thyroxine is going to reduce the blood sugar levels because it's breaking down sugar, right? Okay, so insulin, blood sugar goes down, thyroxine goes down, epinephrine goes up. Okay, so we'll go on to the next page. Next page is talking about I think we might have to move a little more quickly here to get through this. So we're talking about the gonads, which is another word for the testes and ovaries. So we know that the testes in males produce testosterone, which has to do with the secondary sex characteristics. Okay, so we're talking about bone growth, muscle development, sex drive, all that. Kind of the counterpart in females is estrogen. Okay, so we're talking about development of breasts, widening of hips, menstruation. Okay, so those two are counterparts, and then in females as well, progesterone is going to be maintaining uterine lining during pregnancy and inhibiting uterine contractions. All right, so looking at this next question here, use of the following information to answer, okay, question 8. So it says in humans, high levels of GnRF, so gonadotrophin release factor, would cause the pituitary to release. What do you think this is going to be? Okay. Now the pituitary is going to release these two guys, the gonadotropins, LH and FSH. Okay. The pituitary will release those, and it's going to cause the ovaries to produce two hormones. Do you remember which answer that would be? If we were talking about which hormones are produced by the ovaries? Our answer for this question, that's right, that would be estrogen and progesterone. Okay, but the answer for this question, the pituitary is going to produce LH and FSH, and they're going to act on the ovaries to produce estrogen and progesterone. Okay, on to the next one. This says, in order to initiate in vitro fertilization, a woman must undergo hormonal therapy to release numerous eggs and to prepare the uterine lining. The eggs are removed using a laparoscope and fertilized in a petri dish. The developing embryos are inserted back into the woman for implantation to take place. What hormone changes would cause a female to develop and release a large number of mature eggs? So if you kind of focus on two things, it's talking about developing eggs and releasing eggs. So eggs being produced in the first place, and then eggs developing, or we could think of another word as maturing. Okay, now you guys remember which one of the hormones, which one of these two would be causing eggs to be produced in the first place? Would it be LH or FSH? So which produces ovulation? Okay, ovulation is actually produced by LH, and then the maturing of the eggs is going to be FSH. I was telling these guys earlier that if you want to remember that FSH starts with an F. So think of the word finishing, and if you kind of make that association between finishing and maturing, so FSH causes the maturing of the eggs, okay, or the maturing of the sperm in males. Okay, so the answer here would be increased FSH and LH, answer A. All right, so, excuse me, we're going to look into two conditions, hypothyroidism and hyperthyroidism. If you Google hyperthyroidism on the internet, and you, excuse me, if you look on, sometimes you can search by image, you could see some pictures of people, and it's really kind of unfortunate the way it affects people, hypothyroidism, but it can affect people by causing their eyes to be really, really wide and kind of, you might say goggly-eyed. So that's something that happens. But basically it's the overproduction of thyroxine, right? And so, you've got too much thyroxine being produced. So we know that thyroxine is breaking down sugars. So because of that, we're getting a lot of energy being produced. So we see that some of the symptoms are high energy, difficulty gaining weight, and nervousness. Okay, so hypothyroidism, opposite. Basically everything that's a symptom for hyperthyroidism is going to be the opposite. So it's going to be low energy and all that kind of stuff. Okay, so now just looking at how the growth hormone, human growth hormone, affects people. So gigantism is a situation that can occur. We looked at a term called agromegaly, I think it is. That's exaggerated bone growth. And so dwarfism is the opposite, underproduction of growth hormone. All right, and now just looking briefly at hypoglycemia and hyperglycemia. If you want to make a connection here, just think of glycogen and glucose. Okay, so it has to do with hypo always means that it's a small amount. Think about a hypodermic needle. Hypodermic needle is a very small end on it. So if you want to kind of make that connection with hypo and hyper is too much, hypo is too little. So hypoglycemia, too much or too little sugar. So the reason why you've got too little sugar must be because you've got too much insulin, right? Because insulin is taking it into the cells, and so we don't have enough in the bloodstream. That's right, what you said, Tristan, about gigantism. It's caused by a tumor on the gland, and that's often the case, eh? Some sort of tumor is affecting the hormone levels. Okay, so looking at the difference here, excuse me. So again, the difference, hypoglycemia, hyperglycemia. So this is diabetes. This is one form of diabetes, and so the blood sugar level is rising above normal. And too little insulin, and so people need to take insulin during this sort of diabetes. And you might know someone who has to take insulin. It's not a lot of fun to have to do that all the time, but they are making it easier than it used to be. Okay, so again, I just wrote here, insulin's like a key that unlocks a cell so sugar can enter it, and without insulin, our bodies can't use the sugar in them. So, going on to the next page, okay, so I won't go into this a lot, the difference between insulin diabetes, insulin-dependent diabetes, non-insulin dependent diabetes. These are important to know, and again, this one is also known as juvenile diabetes. It occurs before 20. But we're going to just look briefly at what happens when you eat a meal and you've got a lot of blood sugar. Okay, so you've got a lot of blood sugar. Your body needs to use that blood sugar, so it produces insulin so the sugar can get into the cells, right? But then also you want to store that blood sugar. And so what the liver does, we saw that the liver produces glucagon, and so then glucose is produced into glycogen, which is kind of like the body's storage form of sugar. And the overall result then is that blood sugar is decreased, so again you got a kind of a negative feedback system going on. So that's what happens when you've got high blood sugar. Got low blood sugar, opposite situation. Okay, so the pancreas is going to release glucagon, and so in this situation you're going to be, glucagon again is going to cause the glycogen to be changed into glucose, or rather, I'm sorry, yeah, because we've got a low blood sugar, we want to produce more glucose from the glycogen, and also the liver is going to do its conversion as well. So that's where the conversion actually takes place. Okay, so the pancreas stimulates the glucagon, and the actual conversion takes place in the liver. And the overall net result is the blood sugar is increased. All right, so on to the next page. I think what I'm going to have to do, guys, I don't think we're going to be able to finish this, and I'm going to have to pay attention to time a little bit more closely next time. What I'm going to do is wrap it up in the next few minutes, and then I'm just going to produce a little bit of an extra session on my own. I'll record that and I'll send that out to you guys, because I do think it's important to finish off the last couple questions as well. So I'll just do that later on. Okay? So again, a different type of diabetes here. It's not related to blood sugar levels. So the other one was diabetes mellitus, and this is diabetes insipidus. In this case, you have watery urine, being pale. That's one of the main symptoms of it. Okay? Destruction of ADH. And so at this point, we're just going to start focusing on the nervous system for a little bit. Again, the jobs of the nervous system: receiving information, from our senses, transmitting that information along the nervous system, along the channels, interpretation, and response. Okay, we're not going to really go into this diagram a whole lot here. You guys have seen some of these different branches, like the autonomic parts of the nervous system. But what I do want to highlight here, well, first of all, I just want to ask you guys a question. And we kind of went into this in an earlier question, but how would you say the nervous system and the endocrine system are specialized to maintain homeostasis. And again, that's a sense of balance in the body. Any idea how you would answer this question? Again, it has to do with the difference in their response. One of them responds more quickly, one of them responds more slowly. Which one would be which? Which system enables you to respond more quickly? Would that be the nervous or the endocrine system? It's hormones. Okay, so the nervous system responds really quickly, and hormones, that's a more long-term response, right? Okay, so there's all different kind of receptors in the body, right? And I'm just going to tell you which ones I think are more important. So chemoreceptors are sensitive to different chemicals, and we'll look at that in just a moment. Well, maybe we'll look at it now. Chemoreceptors, two of the most important chemicals they are able to detect are carbon dioxide and oxygen. Okay, so if you've got too much of one or the other, chemoreceptors are going to enable the body to find that out. They're found in the arteries, and so then you're going to have a whole system of responses based on that. Baroreceptors are also found in the arteries. What they basically do is they're excuse me, they're sensitive to pressure or the amount of stretch. And by being sensitive to the amount of stretch in your arteries, they can tell how much blood pressure there is. Okay? So that's what baroreceptors are all about. So again, both of those two types of receptors are found in the arteries. The more stretch, the more blood pressure, right? When you're talking baroreceptors. Osmoreceptors, okay, kind of important. Relate to water, maybe not as important. Mechanoreceptors, vibrations. Photoreceptors, somewhat important. You can see that it's got the word photo in it, so it tells you that it has to do with the eye, or it has to do with light. All right, so now let's say you have a situation where you've got high blood pressure. Well, what's the body going to do to save itself? So that's not really a problem, because as you know, high blood pressure is one of the main causes of death in people, right? You know, because you've got a narrowed artery, and when you've got a narrowed artery, you can get a blood clot that can just, you know, plug up the whole works. Well, what the body does in a situation where the blood pressure is too high, first of all, it decreases the heart rate. Okay, so it's going to slow things down, so you're not going to have so much pressure going through those blood vessels. The other thing it's going to do is what's called vasodilation. So dilate is to open, so you're going to open up the blood vessels. Well, that's going to reduce the amount of pressure in them, right? The opposite of vasodilation is vasoconstriction, when you're closing things down. Okay? So both those things, if the body does both those things, it's going to result in less blood pressure. And that's what we want, right? Okay. Good stuff. So, so what would the answer be then for this next question here? The function of carotid stretch receptors is to, what do you think? The stretch receptors. What do you think they would relate to? Remember the carotid, that's the carotid artery. And what kind of receptors are found in the artery? Okay, this is going to relate to our blood pressure, right? Because this is going to be the baroreceptors, and the baroreceptors have to do with blood pressure, and again, the way they're able to detect how much blood pressure is going on is by how much stretch there is in those arteries. Okay? So, going on now to, okay, we know the nervous system is made up of three parts: brain, spinal cord, and nerves. The first two parts, the brain and the spinal cord, make up the central nervous system. The nerves is the peripheral nervous system. We're going to look at just a little bit more at this point. We're going to focus on neurons. Again, a neuron is a nerve cell. Okay, three different types of neurons: sensory neurons, motor neurons, and association neurons. So let's have a little bit more in-depth look at those. So what do sensory neurons do? Well, of course, they sense, right? They pick up information from our environment, and where's that information going to go? It's going to go to the brain or the spinal cord, right? Okay. Motor neurons, you know, like a motor is moving, right? So we're talking about the movement of our muscles. So they're going to carry messages from the brain or the spinal cord to the muscles. Okay, so they're going to be activating our muscles or a gland or an organ to do something, right? Okay, so sensory neurons sense something. Motor neurons cause something to move or something to be done, right? Association neurons carry messages from one neuron to another. They're also known as interneurons. All right, so if you were going to differentiate between sensory and motor nerves, what would you say? What is the job of the sensory nerves? Okay, they carry messages from where to where? Okay, remember, it's our body, it's things like our fingers, the outer parts that are doing the sensing, and so they're going to carry things to the brain, right? In motor neurons, it's going to be an opposite situation. They're going to carry things from the brain to what? What's one of the most obvious things we could think of when we're thinking of a motor? A body part that might be kind of, similar to a motor. Maybe something like the muscles, right? Okay. All right. So, just looking at the basic structure then of a neuron, we've got the dendrite. So messages are received by the dendrites. Okay, they look like the type of structure that could receive something, right? Kind of got finger-like projections. The message is then sent to the cell body. That's the larger part here. Then it moves on to the axon, and eventually there goes to these nerve endings. Okay? So, let's look at a question that has to do with this. So, what would be the job of the dendrites? Again, the finger-like projections. Okay, they receive information. Do you guys remember what the importance is of the myelin sheath? It's kind of an insulating layers, okay? And because of that insulation, it allows the transfer of information to happen more quickly. All right, so that's the purpose of the myelin sheath, and then the axon kind of passes on the information. It's the end of the road, right? All right, so a synapse is a gap between a nerve cell and a receptor. Okay, so you've got some sort of a receptor, and it's communicating with the nerve cell. It's giving it a message, but a synapse is a gap, and we're going to look at that in just a sec. It's a gap between the two. That's what a synapse is. Remember, whenever you're talking about messages being sent to nerve cells, the messages that are sent are in the form of neurotransmitters. These are special kind of chemicals, right? Okay, so let's look at a diagram then. Okay, so here's a diagram, and for some reason these didn't all show up here. This is showing two different, like this could be a gland or a muscle, communicating with another one, and here's the messages that are in between them. All right, so this here is saying use the model of the synapse to explain why nerve impulses move from neuron A to neuron B, but not necessarily back in the other direction. Any ideas why that would be? Why they would move in one direction but not the next? Well, remember that in order to move from one neuron to another, you've got the chemical message being sent, right? So if that chemical message is being sent from A to B, then something's going to happen to B. And remember, when a nerve cell has received the message, then it is called a polarized nerve cell, right? And so when that happens, then it starts doing its stuff. But if B has not sent a message back to A, if there's no no chemical, no neurotransmitter being sent from B to A, then there's no reason to think that neuron A is going to be stimulated by neuron B, right? Okay, so there has to be that neurotransmitter. And okay, so I just said here tiny dots are a chemical message from one nerve cell to another. For instance, the nerve cell on the left might be sending a message saying contract to the muscle cell on the right. It's kind of an example of how these cells interact. Okay, so we looked earlier at this fight or flight response, right? You know, so it's an emergency response. The body is either going to fight or it's, you know, flight, you're going to run, right? Some sort of emergency response. This is the sympathetic nervous system that does this. And if you want to try to maybe make a mental connection between the fight or flight response and the sympathetic nerves, maybe just think about the fact that if, you know, someone's being beaten up by a bully, you have sympathy towards them, right? That might be a way of kind of remembering it. But again, we looked at the fact that muscles and other systems like breathing, heart rate are going to increase, and things like digestion are going to decrease. All right. So we'll go on to the next page. So that's the sympathetic nervous system. Parasympathetic nervous system, if the sympathetic nervous system has to do with fight or flight, then the parasympathetic nervous system has to do with rest or digest. And so these systems speed up digestive responses, slow down muscle responses. Okay, so we're going to go into a question here. Damage to which of the endocrine glands would most affect the reaction of the body to an emergency that stimulates the sympathetic nervous system? So which of the following endocrine glands do you think? Thyroid gland, adrenal gland, anterior pituitary, posterior pituitary. Which one of those glands has to do with the sympathetic nervous system, has to do with an emergency, fight or flight? What do you guys think of? What hormone do you think of when you think of the fight or flight response? Okay, that's right. It's going to be adrenaline, right? Good stuff. All right, and for the next question, jogging will increase heart rate to change because of, what are you going to do? Which system are you going to increase if you're talking about jogging, and which are you going to decrease? Increase sympathetic, decrease parasympathetic. That's right. Okay, good stuff. So we're going to look into just a little bit here about what an action potential is. So basically, there's a number of words that all mean the same thing. If a cell has been charged, that means it's received a message, and that means it has an action potential, and that means it's a polarized cell. Those all kind of mean the same thing. So when a cell is charged, it has to do with the flow of sodium and potassium. One is flowing into the cell, the other one's flowing out of the cell. Okay, sodium flows in, potassium flows out. And it has to do with the sodium-potassium pump. Now, all right, so normally a cell has a negative charge on its inner membrane. Okay, so that's a non-charged cell. When a cell is carrying a message, it's got a positive cell. And again, that has to do with the flow of the sodium and potassium. Which one's flowing in more quickly is going to govern, you know, what the overall charge of the inner cell is. Okay, so we get a charge reversal when that happens, and that's called depolarization. Okay, so when we go from a negative, which is a normal resting cell, to a charged cell, which is a positive cell, that's called a depolarized cell. And what happens is a wave of depolarization occurs. Okay, and that's on the cell membrane where that wave of depolarization is occurring. But eventually what happens is, after a cell has carried a message and it's been polarized, then it's going to return to normal. And this is called repolarization. Okay, so after a nerve cell has been charged or depolarized, eventually it becomes normal again or repolarized. And so I then wrote down here, I wrote something about the time required for repolarization is called the refractory period. Okay, so that's the amount of time it takes for a cell to go from a charged state to a normal state. Okay, so Tristan, you wrote polarized is neutral. Yeah, that's right. And depolarized is when you're going to be talking about a charged state, right? And so once the refractory period is over again, then the cell is able to fire again. Okay, so what is a polarized membrane? And you said that that's neutral. Okay, and that's right. It's a resting cell, right? Okay. Now, an important thing to remember is that I don't know if you guys remember this term, all or none response. So basically, any stimulus below what's called the threshold level produces no response. If you don't have enough stimulation of the cell, you get no response at all. It's not like the... Oh, hi Ashley. Oh, it looks like people are coming in for the next session, so we probably better get going here, guys. I think we're actually fairly close to the end. But what I'm going to do, guys, is I'm going to wrap things up right now because maybe I'll just quickly explain this, and then I'll just finish off the last couple of questions on another whiteboard recording, because we do have a few more important things to cover here, and I'll just send those out as well. But the important thing to know here is that any electrical stimulation which is below the threshold level, there's no response at all. It's not like you get a little bit, you get none at all. But then any above the threshold level, you get a full response. And if it's above that amount, it doesn't matter how much it is above that amount, you always get just a full response. Okay? So that's called the all or none response of a nerve cell. And so, so I'm just going to wrap it up here at this point, guys, and I'm just going to send you out a bit of a recording later on as well for the stuff that we didn't finish. And I also need to let you guys know that we will be having a test soon, and once we do start the test, they're going to be starting to come fairly close one after the other. And the first test is going to relate to the endocrine system, because it's kind of an important enough concept that we just focus the first test just on that. And there's a lot of material, a lot of terms to know for that as well. So I'll be sending out some info about that fairly soon. Yeah, you know it, eh, Brennan? You guys know it. So, so guys, I'll wrap it up at this point then. I want to thank you for all your good participation in the meeting, and hope you guys have a great rest of the week.